morning, everyone. It is Wednesday, February 28th, 2018. And today I thought I'd talk about my favorite Nirvana book. So there are a ton out there, and I've read most of them. I read the Kurt Cobain's Journals, which was like a posthumously compiled book of all his writings and cartoons. It was kind of controversial. People were like, yo, he wouldn't have wanted that published. I read that. I read Charles Cross's fantastic biography, which is called Heavier Than Heaven, which is the title's a reference to a tour they did with Tad before they got super big. That book is interesting because he compiled tons of interviews, and there's a really interesting chapter on how he imagined the day Kurt killed himself, what that was like. Like, some people were like, well, you can't speculate because we don't know quite what happened, but it's like he pieces the evidence together, and it's that's a really cohesive book, and there's an audible version of that. There is this book which Krist Novoselic wrote in 2004, which is called Of Grunge and Government. And it's a book about how democracy works in the history of like how punk rock relates to a lot of America's political beliefs, like the whole idea of coming together, and like how voting is very punk rock, and it has a great chapter on like what it was like starting out in Olympia and Aberdeen back in the day. This is a good book. It's short, as you can see, and I like this one. So, Michael Azarrad, that's the book we're going to talk about today. He wrote this book called Our Band Could Be Your Life, which is a great indie history of like all the indie bands, and he's got a chapter on all of them, like Black Flag, Minutemen, Mission of Burma. That's how I first heard of Mission of Burma. Minor Threat, of course, Husker Du, The Replacements, Butthole Surfers, Big Black, which was Steve Albini's band, Dinosaur Jr., Fugazi. It's really good. So I read this in like 2005. And I found out about this book from someone when I was out with Bowling for Soup, and I read it on the bus, and I just fell in love with it because it's about the indie underground. So Michael Azarrad also wrote this, which is the book we're going to talk about today, Come As You Are, The Story of Nirvana. And there's a documentary called About a Son, where they took all Kurt's recorded interviews and set it to like footage of him growing up around Washington. So I saw that movie, and then I saw the Montage of Heck at South by Southwest, and the guy did a Q&A, and I was like, the director was talking about how he made the movie, and I was like, man, I really want to like read the book that the other documentary is about, which brings us to this point. So Come As You Are is really cool because he sat down with Kurt and everyone while everything was happening. Like, Kurt was still alive when this came out, and they kind of like, they had Michael and Kurt had this split because when Kurt first went into a coma in Rome when he overdosed, Michael did a interview, and Kurt and everyone felt that was like betraying their trust. So that was kind of sad. So it ends with a posthumous chapter about the aftermath of Kurt's suicide. But anyway, it's really interesting because they're talking about everything as it happens. And I really was intrigued by this book because they're so amazed that it's happening in the first place. And in an era where we're all trying to get views and like attention, Kurt's focus was not so much on trying to be more famous. Like, they wanted to make a good record. They thought the David Geffen's label was cool because Sonic Youth was on it, but they weren't really trying to be huge and successful. They never imagined that Nevermind could have been as big as it was. It was all just like this accident. Some other things I learned from this book is that Kurt, Dave, and Krist were all fighting. You know, Kurt wanted retroactive songwriting royalties for Nevermind, and they were all like, no, we're not feeling that. Like, so the band was on the verge of breaking up. Also, I didn't realize how much the press had messed with him. Like, so much of In Utero is about these vindictives against the press. Lynn Hirschberg did this article in Courtney Love and Vanity Fair where Courtney like made jokes and talked about how she did heroin when Frances Bean was inside of her, and that got a lot of controversy, and they took her away from them when she was born. So it's a lot of like, there's a lot of interesting stuff on how there was this weird cycle of like Courtney Love, Kurt Cobain, the press, and the fact that like all this created this context for him to just do all the heroin he wanted. So that's why they didn't do Lollapalooza, and that's what was the catalyst for the tragic ending. But there are all these other like interesting things, like sad things like Kurt's stomach problems, which heroin was one of the only things that helped. But I think like what struck me as interesting was how effortless it was when they all got in the studio. When Nirvana was working, they were so good, and that was the reason why I learned guitar, was playing those songs, the songs from Unplugged. I remember I had an acoustic guitar and like had the songbook, and I'd learn the chords, and you'd learn E minor, G, that's about a girl, right? Like basically, they changed music a lot. No one will ever be like Nirvana again. And I think what inspires me about them was how they just made their music and everything fell into place. The record labels had money because they had just put the back catalogs on CDs, so there was so much money, and they were like, let's try anything, and it hit. So I recommend this book a lot, Come As You Are. It's my favorite Nirvana book. And then I recommend checking out Heavier Than Heaven by Charles Cross. I'm MC Lars. Thanks for checking out today's diary. All right, have a good week. It's half over, but all right, peace. Oh, for more thoughts and crazy videos, please subscribe, and please check out my other stuff. Peace.